Reed tossed his cell phone onto the passenger seat next to him. He tried to call his wife and tell her that he was heading to his next destination, but, as usual, she did not answer. His marriage was hanging by a thread, and he knew it. He loosened his tie and threw it on the seat next to the phone. Ever since he got promoted, everything has gone wrong. At his new job, he was often on the road. His territory covered the southern states. He had a feeling that his wife was cheating on him while he was away, but he didn't have enough evidence to confront her. He picked up the phone again. While he was dialing the number, the car drove off the road, and he pulled it back. As he raised the phone to his ear, the front of the car began to bounce and the steering wheel jerked back and forth. He slowly pulled over to the side of the road. The call didn't go through. As he got out of the car, he noticed no signal on his phone panel. "Damn," he said, running a hand through his brown hair. He walked around the car and saw a flat tire. He opened the trunk, took out a jack, a spare, and a wrench, and began to act. When he removed the tire, the brake caliper fell off. When he picked it up, his mood worsened. The caliper was damaged, and if it was going to drive the car, it would need to be replaced. He stood up and kicked the car, causing tears of pain to form in his eyes. He limped to the car and reached for his phone. There was still no signal, so he walked around the car, holding the phone in the air, hoping to get enough signal to contact his office. He looked ahead at the long road, then back to where he had come from. There was nothing anywhere, no signs of life as far as the eye could see. He remembered that he had not passed through any city for almost an hour. Disgusted, he threw the phone into the car and sat down. Reed woke up to the sound of tires rumbling down the highway. When he opened his eyes, darkness fell. He stood outside the car and waved his arms above his head. The truck stopped in front of him, the headlights blinding him. Then he heard the door creaking open and closing with a creaking sound. On the 4x4 side, the driver was driving at an angle. Well, that's what Reed thought anyway. From the silhouette, he realized that the driver was a woman. She was wearing a baseball cap, and he could see her hair pulled back into a ponytail. As the woman walked, he watched her hips sway back and forth. "You chose a hell of a place to break down, mister," the girl said with a pleasant southern accent. "Yes, ma'am, I have to agree with you on this. There is no cell service here, and you were the first person to appear in the last few hours." The girl stepped out of the light, and Reed felt sweat form on his palms. The girl looked like she stepped out of a country music video. She was wearing cut-off denim shorts that barely covered her belly. White front pockets peeked out from under the legs of the shorts. Her legs were long and tanned, and she wore boots that reached mid-calf. As she stood up, she tucked her thumbs into her front pockets, and her hips rocked to one side. She was wearing what Reed thought looked like a flannel shirt, but the sleeves were cut off, the buttons on the front were undone about halfway, and her ample breasts were poking out of the lace bra she was wearing. The bottom buttons of the shirt were not buttoned, but tied in a knot just above her button-studded belly button. Reed stepped forward and could barely see her eyes peeking out from under the bill of her cap. "Yes, there is almost no movement here. What do you think your problem is?" Reed told her about the caliper, and that if he could contact his office, he could have them contact someone in the area to bring him another car or repair the one he had. "Well, my trailer is a little further down the road. I have a phone that you can use if you want." "Oh, that would be great, thank you. Just get in the pickup, no problem." Reed grabbed his phone, wallet, and briefcase and headed towards the truck. He opened the door and climbed inside. He turned to look at the driver as she grabbed the steering wheel and climbed into the truck. Reed could see that the girl had blonde hair, but could see her brown roots starting to show. She looked at him as she squeezed the clutch and put it into gear. She switched them with ease. Reed was mesmerized by how gracefully she did it and how her breasts bounced from the rough ride of the truck. He realized he was looking at her and looked into her face. She smiled at him, and he felt the blood rush to his face. "Don't be embarrassed, my girls always attract people's attention." "Sorry, I don't know what—" "I'm Amanda, but most people just call me Mandy. I'm used to people looking at my breasts. It's normal." Reed Dalton, and I'm sorry, they're cute, but I shouldn't have stared at them. So, Mr. Reed Dalton, what are you doing here in the middle of nowhere? Work and my GPS said it was supposed to be a shortcut. Ha, you need another GPS. Reed just laughed as Mandy turned onto a small dirt road. She shifted gears as the truck bounced on the rough road. He just held the door handle and enjoyed the ride. A few minutes later, Mandy pulled into a short driveway and parked in front of an old mobile home. She opened the door, turned, and slipped out of the truck. She looked back. Are you going out or are you going to sit in the pickup truck all night? Reed opened the door, got out of the truck, and walked over to where Mandy was opening the door to the mobile home. It's not much, but it's home. Just throw this shit on the floor while I find the phone, she said, taking off her cap and brushing her hair back, then forward. Reed picked up some clothes from the shabby couch and began laying them out on the floor when he realized he was holding a pair of thong panties. He placed them on the table when Mandy reappeared with the cordless phone. He picked up the phone and dialed the number, transferring the call fee to his credit card. When the other end answered, he stood up and began pacing around the room. The location was not bad for such a limited space, he thought. There was a kitchen, a dining room, and a living room, all in one. There were 2 doors in the short corridor. He assumed it was a bathroom and a bedroom. He continued to pace around the room, talking to someone on the other end of the line. While talking, he turned around and saw Mandy sitting on a chair and taking off her shoes. She bent her leg, holding her foot in her hands, and pulled. Reed couldn't take his eyes off her upper thigh. Pulling off one shoe, she lifted her other foot and repeated the movement. He quickly changed the direction of his gaze before he was caught again. While he continued to talk on the phone, Mandy walked over to the refrigerator and opened it. She bent at the waist, which caught Reed's attention. The shorts she was wearing rode up her mounds, and as they pulled up, he saw the perfect imprint of her round ass. He felt weak as blood gushed from every part of his body and headed towards his manhood in his pants. Mandy stood up, turned, and pointed the beer can at Reed. He nodded his head. He pressed the button to end the call, shaking his head. "What's happened?" Mandy asked, raising a can of beer to her lips. "Well, my office is going to get me another car, but it won't be until late tomorrow morning. This really sucks, but you can stay here if you want. The couch turns into a bed, and I can drive you to your car in the morning." "Will this cause any inconvenience?" "Hell no. I don't have to go to work until tomorrow night. That's okay. Can I make one more call to let my wife know that I'm behind Schedule A and won't be home for a couple of days?" "Please." Reed dialed his wife's cell phone while Mandy sipped her beer. She crushed the can in her hand, stood up, and threw it into the trash. She walked into the back room while Reed was leaving a voicemail on his wife's phone. After hanging up, he heard water running in the bathroom. He sat down on the sofa, kicking off his black ostrich-toed Barker shoes. Reed took a sip of his beer and made a grimace. He hadn't drunk cheap beer since college. He held his breath and took another long sip. He stood up, unbuttoned his Oxford shirt, placed it on the arm of his chair, and leaned back on the sofa. At 35, Reed was in excellent shape. He had dark brown hair and matching eyes. His arms and chest were chiseled. Despite all his traveling and marriage, he did not frequent the bars in the cities and towns where he stayed, but spent his evenings in hotel gyms. Sitting up, he surveyed his surroundings. Mandy had a simple house, nothing like the one he was used to living in, but he was grateful that he wouldn't be sleeping in his car. Mandy returned to the room where Reed was sitting. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. She was now wearing a Texas Longhorns t-shirt that barely covered her round ass. Reed noticed that her nipples were hard and protruding slightly through the cotton material. She sat down on the other end of the sofa and pulled her knees to her chest. Reed noticed a small red piece of fabric from her panties. He took another long sip of his beer. "Did you call your old lady?" Mandy asked, removing polish from her toes. "Left a message," Reed replied, trying not to stare at his gorgeous owner. "It's really late in the East. What do you think she's doing so late at night?" "I don't know. Maybe she's sleeping and doesn't hear the phone ringing." Reed felt awkward talking about his wife. He had no idea where she was or what she was doing. So he decided to change the subject. Over the next few minutes, Reed asked Mandy about her life. In the conversation, he found out that she was 22 years old. She dropped out of school when she was 16 and married who she considered the man of her dreams. As it turned out, after they got married, her husband became drunk and violent. He lost his job and took his anger out on her. He beat her and then raped her repeatedly before leaving her to sleep with his many girlfriends. Reed listened as Mandy told many stories about her hard life. When Reed asked where he was now, she responded by saying that one day her father showed up in the middle of one of her husband's rampages, and her father beat him up and put him in his truck, and she hasn't seen him since. Reed took another long sip of his beer. "Enough of my horror story. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Reed Dalton," Mandy said, stretching out her long, tanned legs on the couch, placing her feet on Reed's lap. Reed told her about his life, about growing up in a small town in Georgia and going to college in Atlanta. He told her about his job, how he worked hard and became a sales executive, how he traveled a lot and how his travels affected his marriage. He explained that since he had been gone for 40 weeks a year, his wife had changed. He told Mandy about his suspicions that his wife was cheating on him, but he had no proof and didn't really want any. He chatted incessantly for what seemed like hours. Mandy was attentive and made short, kind comments while he spoke. "That's how I got here," he finished. Mandy sat up with her legs still in his lap. She rested her head on her hand, and a comforting smile appeared on her face. "I'll tell you one thing. Your old lady doesn't know how lucky she is to have a caring husband." Her fingers combed the hair above his ear. "Not only a caring husband, but also a hot one." Reed looked at her and blushed. His heart was pounding in his chest, his palms were sweaty, and his stomach was swarming with flies. "So what do you do, Mandy? I mean, for work?" Reed asked, feeling his voice shake. "Well, I guess you could say I'm in the entertainment business," she replied with a sweet laugh. "In the cinema? In the theater?" he asked innocently. "Oh no, honey. Although I've been in 1 or 2 videos and you could say I'm an actress, in a weird way." Mandy removed her legs from his lap and placed them on the floor. She stood up and walked over to the radio on the kitchen table. She leaned over, changing the station until she found a song she liked. She began to slowly rock her hips as she turned. "I'm an erotic dancer in a club outside of Dallas." She continued to dance seductively, lifting the hem of her t-shirt, showing Reed her red thong. She lifted her shirt a little more, showing off her toned abs and sparkling belly button stud. "This job is nothing special, but it pays the bills, and she gave me some extra money to buy girls," she added, placing her hands on her chest and shaking them. Mandy continued to dance seductively around the living room, showing Reed just enough to turn him on. She moved closer to him, the look in her eyes driving him crazy. She moved between his legs, rocked her hips, and turned. Her round ass was right in front of him. She lowered her ass just above his knees. She moved her hips up and down, and with each movement she moved closer to his groin. Reed had been to a few strip clubs before, but none of the girls who danced for him turned him on like Mandy. Mandy lifted the hem of her t-shirt and pulled it over her head. She continued to move her hips, turning her naked back to him. With a few more swings of her hips, she lowered her ass onto his lap. She pressed her hips against his growing manly tool and moaned as she felt the hard tool press against her ass. She crossed her arms over her chest, turning around. She danced for a few seconds before removing her hands from her chest. Reed's eyes grew to the size of saucers. Her breasts were amazing. They were at least 36D. They seemed to be too big, but they suited her perfectly. Her areolas were deep pink, the dime-sized buds protruding from her mounds at least an inch. Each bud had gold rings. Her hands pressed her breasts together. His thumbs and forefingers pinched the buds, pulling them. She licked her lips as she looked at the bulge in Reed's pants. She danced towards Reed and leaned over him, placing her hands on the back of the couch, inches from his head. His eyes were glued to her large breasts. She teased him. Reed slowly ran his hands up her thighs. Her body was so soft and smooth. Her cotton candy-scented perfume filled his nostrils as she brought her face close to his, brushing her hair into his face and running her neck across his face. His hands stroked her back, and he pressed himself against her back, pressing lightly until her buds were on his lips. She moaned and giggled. Her right hand moved to his head and pressed it harder against the bud. Mandy slowly pulled away and continued her seductive dance. Her hands moved up and down her slender thighs, up her sides, then back down. Mandy turned around and danced back to Reed. She knelt down. Mandy's hand slid up the leg of his trousers, and soon she began to caress his manhood. Reed swallowed hard, looking into her eyes. He never cheated on his wife, and although things weren't great between them, he was always faithful to her. There was something wrong with Mandy. He was in an erotic trance and couldn't stop her. She wrapped her fingers around his shaft and began to slowly stroke it. Reed's eyes rolled back when Mandy started doing this. He hadn't received any attention from anyone for months. As his moans increased, her pace quickened. He put his hands on her blonde hair and cupped her head. His hips lifted off the couch as his climax quickly hit him. For the first time, she took her eyes off him. She lowered herself onto his still, hard shaft. Reed gently caressed her breasts. Her breathing became ragged as she moaned. Her perfume or the body spray she applied seemed to intoxicate him, or he was drunk on the lust he felt for the sexy young woman riding him. Mandy's rhythm began to increase as her climax approached, and then she froze and announced in a loud, shrill voice that she was going to the finish line. He followed her. Then they both collapsed on the sofa. Reed woke up the next morning, rubbed his eyes, and looked around, confused by his surroundings. His memory then flashed back to the events of the previous night. He looked down. He was naked. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. He then stood up and went to the bathroom to empty his bladder. He politely flushed the toilet, walked out of the bathroom and looked towards Mandy's bedroom, but didn't see her, so he returned to the living room and started getting dressed. After getting dressed, he looked outside and saw Mandy sitting at the picnic table with a cup of coffee and a cigarette. He opened the door and walked out to where she was. "Good morning," he said, approaching Mandy. She was back in her t-shirt and had boots on her feet. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" she asked, flashing her $1,000,000 smile. "How is the child? And you?" "Oh, yes. I was dead when I fell on the pillow." "You've loaded me up well," she said, taking a drag from her cigarette. As she exhaled, her smile disappeared and a look of worry appeared on her face. "Reed, I don't want you to get the wrong impression about me. I'm a dancer, not a slut. I usually don't do what I did last night." "Mandy, I would never—" He tried to answer, but was interrupted. "I do not regret anything. I mean, I know you're married, and it wasn't right, but it's been a long time since I've met a real gentleman, and believe me, I've met a lot of men. I also know that there is a chance in hell that someone like you would see me as anything but a piece of ass, and that's okay because that's who I am. I hope everything works out with your wife, but if it doesn't, there will always be a place for you in my bed," she said, putting out her cigarette. "Well, I better take you to town so you can get back to your job." She walked inside, grabbed a pair of shorts and buttoned them, closing the door. They drove in silence along the road to Dallas, where he was to pick up the car. The ride lasted about an hour, and, aside from small talk, the ride was quiet. As they pulled into the outskirts of town, Mandy pointed to the club where she worked. They drove up to the building that housed the regional office of Reed's company. Before opening the door, he leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. "Thanks for everything, Mandy, and—" She interrupted him again, smiled at him, and seemed to have tears in her eyes. "Anytime, city boy, anytime." She pressed the clutch and drove away. Reed just stood there and watched her leave, then went to the office, took care of everything, and got the car. He stayed in Texas for 2 more days and then flew home. 2 weeks later, Mandy sat in front of the mirror and applied makeup. She stood up, grabbed a can of cotton wool-scented body spray, and applied the appropriate amount all over her body. She applied additional spray to her chest and neck. She adjusted her bikini top to make sure her girls were positioned correctly. Then she turned around and adjusted the strings on her panties so as not to show more than was allowed. She headed towards the stage curtain where she passed Nicole, a sexy brunette who had just finished dancing. "There aren't many people today," she complained, hugging Mandy. "I'm just lucky. The rent is running out and I'm 100 short, so I better go shake my ass to make it," Mandy laughed, kissing Nicole on the cheek. Mandy stood at the curtain and waited for her song to play. When the music started, she came out from behind the curtain and began her routine. Mandy never looked a man in the eyes. She usually just looked at herself in the mirrors that surrounded the stage. When she made her first contact with the pole, she looked in the mirror and froze. Reed was sitting behind her on the stage. Mandy tried her best to do her job, although the anxiety she felt prevented her from doing it. She danced while the song played, but her eyes never left Reed. She swayed her hips seductively and ran her hand up her covered breasts. Her buds always got hard when she danced, but this time they were painfully tight, protruding from the thin material of her bikini. When it came time for the climax of her performance, she climbed onto a shiny pole in the middle of the stage. Wrapping her strong legs around him, she lay on her back. The men sitting around the stage cheered as her perky breasts and hard nipples made their long-awaited appearance. She slowly slid down the pole and, lying on the stage, finished her dance in a throw, turning her ass in the direction of her excited audience. When Mandy looked in the mirror, Reed had disappeared. She collected her tip and went backstage. Embarrassed and disappointed, Mandy walked over to her vanity and began putting her top back on. She freshened up her makeup and got up to go out, chat with the visitors, and try to earn the money she needed. Returning to the bar, she saw Reed again. He stood up from the table and motioned for her to come to him. Smiling widely, Mandy moved towards him. When she approached his table, they hugged and sat down. "Can I buy you a drink?" he asked. "Of course," she replied. "Beer would be nice." Reed called the hostess over. The busty brunette walked over, took their order, and walked her bubble butt back to the bar to get their drinks. Reed turned his head towards Mandy and was greeted with a kiss on the cheek. "Another business trip?" she asked. "Not really," he replied. "I've had some major changes since I last saw you." The hostess returned with their drinks and placed them on the table. Reed paid her what she was owed and added a good tip to it. Mandy picked up her beer and took a long sip, then set the glass back on the table. "So, city boy, what's changed?" she asked, placing her hand on his. "Well, let's see. Since I left you, I filed for divorce and received a transfer," he replied with a smile. Reed told her how he came home from a trip to Texas to find his wife in bed with her best friend's 19-year-old son, and that she blamed him for her infidelity, because he was always on the road. The next day, he called his lawyer and began divorce proceedings. Returning to his home office, he saw an advertisement for an office manager position in the Dallas office. He approached his bosses about his interests. They didn't want to fire one of their best district managers with a demotion, but after hours of persuasion, they approved his transfer. He told her about how he flew back and forth between Dallas and Atlanta to get everything completed, even renting an apartment near the club. "So, you're here forever?" Mandy asked. "Yes. The only thing I need to return to Georgia for in a couple of weeks is to finalize the divorce." "That's great, honey. But why are you here?" "Well, I was hoping you could help me celebrate." "I would love to, but I need to work. I still have 3 hours before I'm free. My rent is due." "Okay, but if you had money, would you come with me to my apartment?" "I would think about it." Reed reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of money. He counted out 5 $100 bills and placed them on the table in front of Mandy. Her brown eyes widened when she saw that kind of money. It was more than she would have earned in 2 nights. She looked back at Reed and smiled. "Let me get my things," she said, standing up and walking off stage. She returned a few minutes later, wearing a loose t-shirt, short shorts, and boots. She didn't even have time to remove her makeup. Reed stood up and put his arm around her back as they walked to the club door. They walked to the parking lot and got into Mandy's truck. Reed gave her the address of his apartment, and they talked briefly during the short drive. Mandy pulled into the parking lot and parked in an empty space. They both then got out of the truck and headed inside, holding hands. Once in the elevator, Reed pulled Mandy towards him, and they began to kiss passionately. His hands went to the small of her back and held her tightly to him. Her hands were on his neck. She ran her fingers through his dark brown hair. The elevator dinged as they reached the floor where Reed's apartment was located. They broke the kiss long enough to exit the elevator, walk down the hallway to the apartment, and open the door to enter. Once inside, they melted into each other's arms, kissing and exploring each other's bodies. Reed broke their kiss, took Mandy's hand, and led her to his bedroom. Once in the bedroom, they started kissing again. While they were kissing, they slowly began to undress each other. And then there was sex. Mind-blowing sex in several rounds and climaxes. When they finished, they both let out shaky signs of exhaustion and pleasure. Her head rested on his upper thigh as her fingers continued to stroke him. Weakened, she lifted herself up on her arms, turned her whole body, and lay down next to Reed. He looked at her and smiled, running his fingers through her hair. She smiled back at him. "That was amazing," she said, still out of breath. "Yes," he answered. "Well, city guy, you know exactly how to have sex." "Well, thank you, ma'am. You're damn good yourself." She smiled. "So what do you plan to do now that you're here?" "Well, I was thinking about moving in with that hot artist I met last time I was here." "Really?" "Yes, really." Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.